The best subwoofer isn't the one you hear. It's the one whose absence becomes impossible to ignore the moment you switch it off. I have absolutely no idea who said that. In fact, I'm pretty sure I just made it up. But after spending several weeks listening to this REL T9X SE in my own system, I've come to the conclusion that I couldn't describe it any better. Because a great subwoofer doesn't simply add bass. It does something far more interesting. It improves frequencies that it doesn't even reproduce. Sounds impossible? That's exactly what I used to think. When REL Audio suggested I try a REL in my system, my reaction was anything but enthusiastic. I've got a pair of full-range Tannoys. Why on earth would I need a subwoofer? In my mind, this experiment was going to achieve exactly two things. First, it would confirm that my speakers already produced all the bass I could possibly need. And second, it would force me to carry a heavy box into my listening room, an idea that my back rejected immediately. After a brief discussion about who would take responsibility for the inevitable spinal injury, I reluctantly agreed. The truth is, I've always associated subwoofers with home cinema, explosions, earthquakes, spaceships, or that classic shotgun blast that shakes the sofa and occasionally reminds your neighbor that they're part of the soundtrack too. But stereo music? I never believed the subwoofer could make much difference in a properly full-range hi-fi system. And I was absolutely convinced I was right. Mostly because this wasn't my first encounter with low frequencies. Long before I started this hi-fi channel, I spent many years working professionally in live sound, concerts, live shows, conference, large-scale events. Besides operating PA systems, I was often responsible for training new sound engineers. There was always a point during the training when I let them take complete control of the mixing console. I'd simply stand back and watch, without touching a thing. After all, the best way to learn is by making mistakes. As long as someone is nearby to prevent those mistakes from becoming a complete audio disaster. I remember countless occasions when someone would walk up to front of house and say exactly the same thing. The sound is too loud. The strange part was, whenever I checked the SPL meter, everything was perfectly normal. The level wasn't excessive. Yet people were still convinced it was too loud. Meanwhile, the trainee engineer would look at me with that unmistakable expression, "What did I do wrong?" Rather than stepping in immediately, I'd usually let them think about it for a while. Because solving your own mistakes is part of becoming a better engineer. But eventually, when the panic became impossible to ignore, I'd ask if I could make a few adjustments. They always agreed, usually with the expression of someone silently begging, "Please save me." And every single time, I did exactly the same thing. I didn't turn the volume down. In fact, quite often, I turn it up. But only in one very specific part of the mix. More bass guitar, more kick drum, more body in the male vocals, more weight in the instruments that provided the musical foundation. A few minutes later, the very same people would come back, this time to say the exact opposite. That sounds so much better now. And the truth was the system was often playing slightly louder than before. So, what was actually happening was surprisingly simple. People weren't really saying the sound was too loud. What they were really saying was, "This sound is making me uncomfortable." And those are two very different things. The human ear doesn't hear every frequency equally. We're especially sensitive to the mid-range and upper mid-range. That's where you'll find most of the energy of the human voice, guitars, snare drums, cymbals, and many other instruments. Now here's where things get interesting. When the sound system lacks proper low-frequency energy or when the overall tonal balance is tilted too far toward the mids, something curious happens. Your brain loses the foundation it uses to make sense of the music. Without that foundation, it starts focusing much more on the frequencies it's naturally most sensitive to. The result, the sound becomes harder, more aggressive, more fatiguing. And strangely enough, it actually feels louder, even when the volume hasn't changed at all. So when I boosted the bass guitar, the kick drum or other low-frequency instruments, I wasn't simply adding more bass, I was restoring balance. Think of bass as the foundations of a house. Nobody admires the foundations, but try building a house without them. Suddenly everything feels wrong. Here's another way to think about it. Imagine a photograph. If you increase the sharpness too much and remove most of the shadows, you can still see every object in the picture. Nothing is actually missing, but the image loses depth. It starts looking artificial. Sound works in much the same way. Bass gives music depth. It gives instruments scale. It gives voices body. And it helps the brain organize everything it's hearing into one coherent experience. Here's a simple experiment. Imagine listening to a man's voice over the telephone. You understand every single word. Speech intelligibility is still there, but somehow that voice no longer sounds completely human. Why? Because you removed exactly the frequencies that give it weight, warmth, and physical presence. Now imagine putting those frequencies back, without changing the volume. The words haven't changed, but suddenly it feels as though the person has stepped into the room. That's the real power of low frequencies. They're not just there to be heard. They're there to give meaning to everything else. And that's where we begin to understand why a truly great subwoofer can do something that seems almost impossible. It doesn't just improve what's happening below 40 Hz. It changes the way we perceive everything happening above it. At first, that sounds like a contradiction, but it isn't. Your brain doesn't analyze music one frequency at a time. It experiences music as a single, complete event. And when the foundation is right, the entire musical structure feels more natural. That's when I realized I might have been completely wrong about subwoofers. Because maybe a great subwoofer isn't there to add bass. Maybe it's there to make sure you never realize it was missing in the first place. That's when I started looking at the REL T9X SE in a completely different way. Because the truth is, REL has never claimed that a subwoofer exists simply to add more bass. In fact, if you read the owner's manual, you'll notice something rather interesting. They hardly even use the word subwoofer. Instead, they call it a sub-bass system. At first, that sounds like marketing. After living with it for several weeks, I'm no longer convinced it is. Because a conventional subwoofer often does one thing: it adds more low-frequency energy. This is trying to do something fundamentally different. It's trying to complete the system. Its purpose isn't to draw attention to itself. It's to make your loudspeakers sound bigger, more effortless, more complete, more natural. As though they'd always been capable of reproducing music on that scale. And that completely changes the way we should evaluate it. The wrong question is, how much bass does it add? The right question is, what happens to the rest of the music when it's switched on? That's exactly what I started hearing. Yes, the bass extended deeper, double basses gained authority, kick drums hit with greater weight, synthesizers reached lower than before. None of that surprised me. The surprise came everywhere else. Voices became almost tangible. Instruments seemed to breathe more freely. The soundstage expanded. Stereo imaging gained depth. And perhaps strangest of all, the treble somehow sounded more open. Not because this REL reproduces high frequencies, obviously it doesn't, but because once the harmonic structure of the music is finally complete, your brain stops searching for what's missing. Everything simply feels more natural. It's one of those things that's incredibly difficult to explain, yet remarkably easy to hear. And that's when I finally understood why so many people say a great REL simply disappears. Of course, it never really disappears. What disappears is your awareness that there's a subwoofer in the room. All that's left is the music. And I honestly can't think of a greater compliment for a product like this. For years, I thought a subwoofer was just another accessory. Now, I see it very differently. When it's properly integrated, it stops being an accessory. It becomes part of your system's identity. That's exactly what happened in my listening room. Now, there's a very good reason why it behaves that way. And it all begins with the way REL believes a subwoofer should be connected. By this point, we've learned something important. A great subwoofer isn't the one that produces the most bass. It's the one that integrates most seamlessly with your main speakers. And this is exactly where REL takes a completely different approach from most manufacturers. The first difference appears before you've even listened to a single note. It starts with the connection. Most subwoofers are connected using a standard RCA cable from your preamp or AV processor. REL supports that too, but for a dedicated two-channel system, they recommend something entirely different: the high-level connection. Instead of feeding the subwoofer from a line-level output, you connect it directly to your amplifier speaker terminals using REL's Neutrik Beacon cable. The first time I heard that, my reaction was probably the same as yours. Wait a minute, I'm connecting another device directly to my amplifier speaker outputs? Isn't that going to steal power from my speakers? The answer is essentially no. And the reason is surprisingly simple. REL's high-level input has an input impedance of around 150,000 ohms. For comparison, most loudspeakers present a load of somewhere between 4 and 8 ohms. So compared to your speakers, the REL draws virtually no current at all. It's much like connecting a voltmeter across a circuit. It's there, it sees exactly the same signal your speakers receive, but it places almost no load on the amplifier. And that's precisely the point. REL doesn't want a different signal. It wants the exact same signal feeding your loudspeakers. The same tonal character, the same dynamics, the same timing. That's what allows it to integrate so convincingly with the rest of the system. Then comes what is probably the single most important part of the whole process: calibration. And I should probably disappoint anyone hoping for a magical setup formula. There isn't one. Every room is different, every loudspeaker behaves differently, every recording is different, but there are a few principles that make all the difference. The first is crossover frequency. The temptation is always to set it too high. Most of the time, that's a mistake. If your speakers already produce solid bass, the subwoofer should only take over where they genuinely begin to roll off. You don't want both systems reproducing exactly the same frequencies. You want one to hand over seamlessly to the other, like two runners passing a relay baton, without anyone noticing where the handover took place. Then comes gain, and here, less is almost always more. The most common mistake people make when setting up a subwoofer for the first time is simply turning it up too much. For the first 5 minutes, it's impressive. Whoa, listen to all that bass. Half an hour later, all you can hear is the subwoofer. And that's the moment you know something isn't right. In my opinion, the correct level is reached when you begin wondering whether it's actually switched on, until you switch it off. And suddenly the music loses weight, scale, depth. That's the moment you know you've got the integration right. One thing that genuinely made me smile was REL's own setup recommendation. Buried in the manual, they suggest using a very specific piece of music, track 4 from the soundtrack of 1992 Robert Redford film Sneakers. Not a random choice. It features a deep, repetitive bass drum pattern that's perfect for judging exactly when the subwoofer stops blending naturally and starts drawing attention to itself. I have to admit, I loved finding that recommendation. In a world where many manufacturers tell you to use pink noise, frequency sweeps, or test tones, REL simply says, play this track. And you know what? It works. It's a far more musical way of calibrating a music system, because in the end, we don't listen to graphs, we don't listen to test tones, we listen to music. That's exactly how I set up this REL, with one goal in mind, to make it disappear. Not physically, that would have been rather awkward to explain to the audio, but sonically, because the less aware I became of the subwoofer itself, the better my entire system sounded. And that's when I realized that maybe the sentence I opened this video with wasn't so ridiculous after all. The best subwoofer isn't the one you hear. It's the one whose absence becomes impossible to ignore the moment you switch it off. When this REL first arrived, I honestly thought it would be just another product to review. At worst, it would simply confirm what I'd believed for years, that a good pair of full-range loudspeakers didn't need a subwoofer. Well, I was wrong. Not because my speakers were lacking bass, they weren't. What I failed to understand was something much more important. A great subwoofer isn't there simply to reproduce everything below 40 Hz. It's there to restore balance to the entire system. Over the past few weeks, I found myself switching it off every now and then, just to check whether the difference was really as significant as I thought. It was. The music was still there. Every note was still there. But something had disappeared. The soundstage collapsed. Voices lost body. Instruments no longer breathed in quite the same way. It was like looking at a photograph that had somehow lost its sense of depth. That's when I realized something. The REL never won me over because of its bass. It won me over because of everything else. It's funny, really. We spend years chasing better decks, better cables, better amplifiers, better loudspeakers. Yet we often overlook the very foundation that supports the entire musical presentation. Maybe that's why this has been one of the biggest surprises I've experienced in hi-fi in recent years. Now comes the difficult part. I have to give it back. And honestly, I'm really not looking forward to it, because I already know exactly what's going to happen. I'm not going to miss the subwoofer. I'm going to miss my system. And perhaps that's the greatest compliment I can pay to any subwoofer. It doesn't make you hear more bass. It makes you miss it the moment it's gone. Thank you very much for watching. I'm João Viçoso. This is Hi-Fi Room, and I'll see you in the next one.